Hello again. So this is now part 3 of lecture 2. So we've been talking about the social determinants of health from the World Health Organization, United Nations perspective, so more of a global perspective, and now we turn to looking at things in the Australian context. So remembering your additional readings from this particular report, Australia's Health, for both last week and this week. So this week's reading is chapter 4, and that reading will go through these in more detail for you. Okay, but let's just go through them one by one. So socioeconomic position, poorer social or economic circumstances equals greater risk of poor health, higher rates of illness, disability and death, and shorter lives. Every step up the economic ladder, the socioeconomic ladder, is accompanied by an increase in health. So the higher someone is, in each level they go further up the socioeconomic position, the more likely it is they'll have greater well-being and better health outcomes. And again, remembering the importance of how these things are interrelated with each other. So education, occupation, and income are all used to define socioeconomic status. So educational educational attainment equips people to be able to achieve a more stable employment, to have more secure income, to live in more adequate housing. So again, thinking about how these things interrelate with each other. An individual's level of education affects not only their own health, but that of their family, and particularly dependent children. Occupation has a strong relationship with someone's position in society. And higher education is, if you have a higher education, you're more likely to have a higher income level. And so, and again, the higher someone's level of education, the more the more likely it is that they will have a higher status occupation. And those higher status occupations are the ones that come with higher income, and they also tend to be more personally fulfilling, as I mentioned earlier. So income and wealth play an important role in socioeconomic position, obviously. And higher income also is associated with greater access to goods and services that provide health benefits, and that includes things like food and housing and additional healthcare options. So people in lower socioeconomic positions are more likely to have a more restricted, narrower range of health options available to them, usually only those ones that are publicly funded. And loss of income through illness and disability or injury can adversely affect an individual's socioeconomic position and also therefore their health. Looking at early life, so the foundations of adult health are laid in utero and during the perinatal and early childhood periods. So that period around someone's birth and also when they're a young child. So, if we think about this in terms of psychology, for example, the more likely it is that someone has their emotional needs met as a child, the more likely it is that they'll have stable relationships, romantic relationships, later in their life. It's a thing called attachment theory. It has quite a strong evidence base. It shows that stable emotional attachment with the primary caregiver, a child, is predictive of healthy relationships later in their life. But that's just in psychology. You can imagine how much the other things that happen to us in our early life will affect our health outcomes later in life. So different domains of early childhood development: physical, social, emotional, and language cognitive, strongly influence learning, social success, economic participation, social citizenry, so how much someone is involved in society, and their health. So healthy physical development and emotional support during the first years of life provide the building blocks for future social, emotional, cognitive, and physical well-being. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to do poorly at school, for example, and then we think, well, what are the knock-on effects of that in terms of a low level of education leads to then what? So likelihood of a lower paying job, a lower prestige job, and therefore lower outcomes in terms of mental and physical health for that person. And so what we can see then normally is if someone is doing poorly at school because of their background, because of what's being provided to them, it becomes this intergenerational transmission of not only poverty but poor health outcomes. So investment in early childhood development has been seen as something that has huge potential to reduce health inequalities and inequities, especially amongst the most vulnerable of children. So social exclusion, it's a broad concept that's used to describe social disadvantage and lack of resources, opportunity for participation and skills. Results from underemployment or unemployment, so remembering that underemployment is something where, say, people that are in casual work, they're employed, but they're not getting enough employment, they're not fully employed, and that is also predictive of poorer health outcomes. It also results from discrimination, from stigma. It can be related to poverty, language, and culture, and prejudices related to those things. And it increases the risk of social isolation, disability, and illness. So it could be related, for example, to race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability, refugee status. All these things are predictive of social exclusion and therefore lower mental and physical health outcomes. So if you think about what I spoke about earlier in terms of the work that I was involved in, suicide research and prevention, that the particular project I was involved in was around people of same-sex attraction, well, LGBTI people more generally, so gender and sexuality, minorities as well as intersex people are more likely to engage in suicidal behaviours. That is what we know from the evidence base. So that is very much likely, one of the factors that's very likely to be causative or associated with that higher level of suicidality in those people is the social exclusion that many of those people have traditionally experienced. And that's why things like the marriage equality law that was passed last year in Australia are so important in normalising the existence of these minorities in Australian society and saying, well, actually, you're no longer excluded. We accept you, and obviously those types of legislation don't automatically lead that, but they go a long way to saying at a governmental level, this is how we see things in Australia, and so gradually making that kind of exclusion, which would have been normal at some point, is something that that shouldn't exist in our society. On the other side of that coin, we've got something which we refer to as social capital. So it's the benefits obtained from the links that bind and connect people within and between social groups. So while we had social exclusion as something that was predictive of poor health outcomes, social capital is the cohesion that we have that's predictive of greater social outcomes, health outcomes. So social connectedness and bonds with our relatives, with friends and other community members are things that will help us through times of poorer health, but they're also things that will make us less likely to have poor health outcomes in the first place because of that connectedness, the capital that we share in terms of our social relationships. So in some cases, it's been shown in research to be predictive of lower morbidity and increased life expectancy, but not in all contexts. But it is certainly resilience against poor health through social support and networks that help people not only feel better about themselves, but it can help them find work, for example. It can help them cope in times of hardship, as it says in that last point there. So unemployment and work, or work and well-being are interconnected, as it shows down at the bottom there. So illness and unemployment, it's a two-way relationship. So there's a strong impact so the psychosocial stress caused by unemployment can have a strong impact on physical and mental health and well-being. And for some, unemployment is caused by illness, but for many, it's the unemployment itself that causes health problems through its psychological consequences and the financial problems that it brings. So it's a two-way relationship between illness and unemployment. And people in socially marginalised groups are more likely to suffer from that. So we can see that connectedness or interconnectedness between the social determinants there. And dimensions of work such as working hours, job control, demands and conditions have an impact on the physical and mental health of individuals, as we've been talking about. And participation, on the other hand, in quality work is something that's health protective, instilling self-esteem, a sense of identity, and providing opportunity for social interaction and personal development. Similarly, with housing and health, we can see the dynamic relationship, or the two-way relationship between the two things there. So there's a gradient in the relationship between health and quality of housing. So as the likelihood of living in so-called precarious housing increases, so that's unaffordable, unsuitable, or insecure housing, as that increases, the likelihood of poor health increases as well. So the relationship's two-way, so that poor health can lead to precarious housing. And single parents and single people generally, young women and their children, and older private renters are particularly vulnerable to precarious housing. And precarious housing can lead to poorer health outcomes. So the residential environment, and this is the last slide for this particular part of this lecture. So the residential environment has an impact on health equity through its influence on local resources, behaviour and safety. Communities and neighbourhoods that ensure access to basic goods and services are socially cohesive, and which promote physical and psychological well-being and protect the natural environment are essential for health equity. So if you think that, if you live in a residential environment that has parks, that has cycling tracks, that has somewhere you can go for a walk in the evening, somewhere where you can go walking with your dog, for example, these are all things that are likely to be protective and promote better health outcomes. Okay, and let's take another break.